Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. This workshop is devoted to the Global Migration Sex Work Nexus, and our sponsors are the Global Migration Lab, the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, through the Joint Initiative in German Studies in particular, and my Canada Research Chair in Global Migration. Rachel Sylvie, the Director of the Asian Institute, and I have organized this, and I'll hand the floor over to her as she's moderating this panel. Rachel.
Thanks so much. So thanks everyone for coming. We've been really looking forward to this event. And I'd just briefly like to say the land acknowledgement. We're grateful to work on this land where for thousands of years, the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit have lived. And we're grateful to live on this land. So our first speaker today, the first panel is titled Sex Work in Europe. And as a whole, the program is designed around two goals. From a sex work positive perspective, it explores sex work, straight and LGBTQ, including Kathoey, as work. What motivates sex workers to join the sector? How do conditions vary by legal status, criminalized, decriminalized, regulated? And how do experiences vary by class, age, and racialized status? Then how does sex work connect with broader regional, national, and global economies? Second, the workshop will examine the migration sex work nexus. What's the relationship between migration and sex work? What particular challenges are faced by migrant sex workers, and how do these vary by age, class, racialized status? And what role does state-generated irregularization play in sex work? So Ursula Probst, hello, from the Free University in Berlin, will be speaking to us, and the title of her paper is Precarious Freedoms, Sex Work, Labor Migration, and European Liberties Between East and West. Welcome, Ursula, Professor Probst.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon to you. On my side, it's already evening and had quite a long day, so please excuse myself if I should slip up at some point. But thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really honored to be here and speak at a workshop with 3 other scholars whose work I appreciate very much, and which was also very helpful for my own work. Yeah, I think I will go right into the presentation, and I will share my screen to do so. Do you see the full screen presentation? I think so, right? Perfect. Wonderful. So thank you again. I'm very happy to be here and present my work here. And to start off with a little shameless self-promotion. So the presentation today is based on a book I recently published entitled Precarious Freedoms, which is my translation from the German Prekäre Freizügigkeiten. And if any one of you speaks German or wants to put the whole PDF through Google Translate, feel free, like it's available open access. But I'm also showing this because I wanted to talk briefly about this lovely German word Freizügigkeiten, as it already conveys these entanglements and frictions I aim to highlight in the presentation today. Because on the one hand, Freizügigkeit refers to the freedom of movement within the European Union, that is, in the German version of like official EU texts referring to all the rights, etc. the EU gives, freedom of movement would be translated as Freizügigkeit, or to be exact, Arbeitnehmerfreizügigkeit. That means the freedom of movement for workers, already highlighting how this is related to work and labor. But on the other hand, Freizügigkeit in German has also another meaning, which is to be sexually open or free-spirited. So although it's not a frequently used word, so don't mind if you forget it, it's not quite useful, to be honest. It does convey the convergence of some of the promises of Europe or the European Union. It is to be able to move freely around and to express yourself freely as well, particularly in regards to your sexuality. But as we're all aware of, these promises only come true for some people, while others are explicitly or implicitly excluded from it, particularly since the dominant ideas of Europe are coming from a mainly Western European, white, Christian middle-class perspective, which not only marginalizes and excludes those considered non-European, but also the regions and people considered Eastern European. And it is the latter relationship between Western and Eastern Europe, which will be the topic of my talk today, and how this relationship is shaping labor migration and experiences with sex work in Berlin in a way that makes it possible for people to access or at least follow ideas, and mostly neoliberal ideas, of European liberties, while at the same time, and also in doing so, remaining in precarious conditions. So before I get into this any further, I want to give you some context and background to the research I'm about to discuss. First of all, it's important to notice that in Germany, sex work is legal, but heavily regulated. Being able to work legally under certain circumstances, one of which is having a work permit to begin with. So everybody who doesn't have a work permit for Germany also can't do sex work legally. Being able to work legally, for those who can, does not mean that sex workers automatically get access to Germany's social welfare system, because most sex workers work through self-employment, which actually makes it very expensive in most parts, but also difficult, in some cases even impossible, to access public health insurance, for example, or public welfare schemes on the basis of the work. And the aforementioned regulations include, among many other things, zoning laws in most German cities. Berlin being one of the two exceptions here, but those zoning laws in most cities ban sex work in most parts of the cities and ban it to like either very remote areas or very like small red light districts. And since 2017, with the introduction of the Prostitution Protection Act, it is also mandatory for sex workers to register as sex workers in order to work legally, as well as to undergo mandatory health counseling. And there's also a variety of regulations for running a sex work venue, meaning that operating a brothel or similar establishments is legal or can be done legally. And my research is mainly based on ethnographic fieldwork conducted between July 2017 and August 2018 at various sites in Berlin. So that would include areas of street-based sex work, brothels, strip clubs, and also talking to people who advertise services online. At this time, as mentioned, the Prostitutes Protection Act was already in effect, but not yet enforced in Berlin. So I will not go into detail about this particular law, also because I think Tuna will say more about this anyway later. So I will leave it up to you. I hope I'm not putting too much work on you with this. But I also wanted to say that I started to get involved in sex work research and politics already a few years prior to the research I will present today. That is, while conducting fieldwork for my master's thesis on female sex workers' perspectives on support services in Berlin between 2012 and 2013. And coincidentally, at the time, sex work regulation became a matter of public discourse again, or like more than the years before. That was because certain people were very critical of the regulation that was in effect since, or still is in effect since 2002, and was considered a failure because it did not improve the living and working conditions of sex workers. It was criticized from a variety of perspectives, so to say. So sex workers' rights activists would criticize it at not going far enough, in sense of that it only provided very basic things that didn't go far enough in terms of securing labor rights and so on and so forth. Whereas anti-prostitution activists would say it like laid the way for human trafficking to increase. And in this context, it was the Eastern European prostitute who figured and still figures very strongly in public debates around sex work as the stereotypical human trafficking victim, the passive, poor woman trafficked to Germany to be exploited. And there was a lot of talk about the Eastern European prostitute, but none of the sex workers coming from Eastern Europe working in Germany were actually speaking in those debates. And that sort of piqued my interest and provided the basis, or like the interest in this research, because I and as many other people were interested in what are actually the living and working conditions of migrants from so-called Eastern European countries in Europe. So I embarked on this research. As mentioned, I went to various sex work venues, meaning that in the course of my research, I talked to people with a variety of experiences in sex work, both in terms of what kind of sex work to do. I did focus mostly on sex work where that happens with physical contact between client and sex worker. So I did not go into digital sex work much, like camming or something. The research group also varied in terms of gender and age, meaning that I talked to predominantly cis women, but also a few trans women and a few cis men, people working in street-based sex work, working in bars, strip clubs, brothels, as escorts, and some as in BDSM studios. And people I talked to were predominantly from Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Poland, Ukraine, and Russia at the time. And since I conducted my research, a lot of things have changed, obviously, not only because of the Prostitutes Protection Act eventually also being enforced in Berlin, but also because of the pandemic happening a few years later, and of recent the consequences of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Those are all things that affected the field, yet, as I argue, the things I will talk about today, which happened prior, are still visible and still a bit more, maybe even became exaggerated. So I will not go into those events in detail, but I will be happy to answer questions about this later to go further on this. So once I started my fieldwork, what did I find out about living situations of and working situations of sex workers from so-called Eastern Europe in Berlin? And I want to start this with one quote from a sex worker, Susanna. This is a pseudonym. I'm using pseudonyms for all the participants, from Hungary, who left Hungary a few years before we met, had been living in various so-called Western European countries, and was working as an escort. And Susanna said, being a whore and Eastern European at the same time is of course stigmatized, but I would never admit that I am from Eastern Europe. Although this is just one sentence, it really piqued my interest, and because usually when we look at debates around sex work, it focuses very much on the stigmatization of sex work, which Susanna here also mentioned. But for her, it was basically worse, or the stigmatization of Eastern Europe was worse than coming out as a sex worker. Many other research participants would probably disagree to the statement, but it was still interesting and shows how far this stigmatization of Eastern Europe in Germany goes, and also highlights that Eastern Europe is not only a particular geographical region, but very much a concept that positions certain people and certain regions to Western Europe in a particular relationship. And this has been best summarized by Anca Parvulescu, a cultural scientist who wrote, in close conjunction to colonial Europe, there's the Europe that has served as a foil for the invention of Eastern Europe. This Europe is part of a continent that goes by the name Europe, but not being Western is therefore not European. As a result, the countries of Eastern Europe have a history of needing to either prove their Europeanness or actively produce it. So within Europe, the currently dominant ideas of what Europe is are very much defined by Western European countries, in the sense of that this isn't even marked in the sense of, we always talk about Europe, European ideas, and of course we sort of know there's not one idea about Europe, but what is mostly being told, portrayed, and also made available as ideas is very much influenced by Western Europe. And there is then this Eastern Europe, which the division, of course, can be related to Cold War area and Iron Curtain, but goes much further if you look at the history, where Eastern Europe has been positioned as kind of some semi-periphery between the West and the rest. And this goes together with, of course, certain gendered, racialized, and classist hierarchies. So within the German context, and it's important to consider that while stereotypes of Eastern Europe exist in many places, how they play out varies. So I'm talking about particular German stereotypes about this. As already mentioned, the Eastern European woman, for example, is often seen as poor, as naive, as not as emancipated as the Western European women. So there's always this saviorism also there in those debates of having to save the Eastern European women to help them to emancipate themselves, coming back to they first have to prove to be European, to be accepted. The poor woman also refers to the classes dimension. So Eastern Europe is predominantly referred to as being poor. And with that also comes certain forms of criminalization. And then there's also racialized component to this, in the sense of that while in Germany, Eastern Europe is perceived as a white region when it itself is problematic, because there's not only white people in Eastern Europe as there are not only white people in Western Europe. People seen as Eastern European, or that would be perceived as stereotype as such, are often people who could be positioned as white, but are seen as less white than Western Europeans. And here I'm leaning on a lot of work on differentiated whiteness, like Lapina Vertilita, who are working on how this then relates to kind of ways of dressing particularly, or manners of speaking. Accent comes in here quite strongly in the context of Germany as well. And so there's a lot of ways that people would be seen as Eastern European, which then relates to them being seen as, poor, less educated, etc. Or in the case of women, particularly in need of saving. When it comes to men, and this is of course also very gendered around the cis heteronormative binary, men would be seen as more aggressive, and also in that sense. But there's also, of course, material differences between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. So there are differences in terms of wealth. That doesn't mean that everyone in Eastern Europe is poor. That only means that there is certain forms of precarization happening, also particularly in the relation between East and West. Because again, coming back to the question of having to prove to be European, if you look at EU enlargements to the East in the last few decades, of course, countries of what is considered Eastern Europe had to fulfill certain criteria to become part of the European Union, which of course other countries also had to do, but this had vast effects on Eastern European economies, partially in a good way, in a sense of that certain people were able to access social mobility, etc., but also led to large-scale neoliberalization programs, that is dissolution or partial dissolution of various social welfare programs, meaning that a lot of people in precarious situations have less of a social welfare system to rely on, for example, than they would have in Germany or other places. And in that context, those European mobilities, those freedoms of movement promised by the European Union, of course, were an advantage, but for some also a necessity. So in general, this freedom of movement is not only like a positive thing, but actually rather ambivalent, meaning that many people have to be in constant mobility to earn enough money to be able to support the families and so on. The idea is that it's often sold as freedom, and being mobile is a good thing and is portrayed as a good thing, and therefore it's also, people also want to access it, but it also comes with the problem that some people just have to stay in constant migration. And this is also true for the research participants I talked to, a sense of that although there were different ideas of what they wanted to do with their life, where they wanted to go, they all did not see a possibility to fulfill those things where they were living before. And also kind of following certain ideas of what Europe is and where Europe is, they came to Berlin. Of course, people also went to many other places, but Berlin is the place where I did my research. So I want to illustrate this with one quote of Irina, a woman from Russia in her early 20s, which kind of shows those ambivalences of wanting to go to Berlin, having opportunities there that you wouldn't have in other places, but at the same time being faced with stereotypization as Eastern European, as a migrant. So Irina told me I came to Berlin mostly by coincidence. I wanted to pursue a postgraduate degree, and Germany offers higher education for free. And in Berlin, I could study my desired program. I also would not have been able to continue doing sex work somewhere else, because in Berlin, it is easy to mingle, to disappear in the crowd, which is better when you want to hide. I did not know much about Germany before I came here, but I had certain ideas about Germany and Western Europe in contrast to Southern and Eastern European countries. I expected a lot, and in some ways, these expectations were met. But in terms of upholding values, I was very disappointed. Being a migrant comes with many problems in Germany, and there are many stereotypes about Eastern Europe. So this was a sentiment that many participants expressed in one way or the other, that their migration was motivated by financial reasons, but not only. Another reason being wanting to access certain ideas also of social mobility, of becoming European. Coming back to, you need to somehow produce it if you come from Eastern Europe, or what is considered Eastern Europe. And then arriving in Berlin and being faced with the fact that they were very much stereotyped as Eastern European, which goes in hand with, for example, being pushed into certain areas of work. So, for example, degrees from Eastern European institutions would be regarded lesser than from Western European or Western or Northern institutions, so to say. So with Irina, it was an interesting case because she had been, before she went to Berlin, studying at an Anglophone university. So when she came to Berlin, she already came with the fact that she had gotten rid of her Russian accent, and she would refer to herself as white. And in combination with all of this, said she can evade those stereotypes of Eastern Europe. Like, she can mingle in a very internationalized crowd in Berlin, where, you know, where you come from might not matter too much. But that, of course, also already shows you how this certain international crowd in Berlin is a very middle class, or at least having access to certain forms of education and way of talking, behaving yourself crowd, which many other participants did not, as they could not access higher education, formal education. So some people had a school degree, some people had a high school degree, or like vocational training, but many people did not have access to university education, or came to Berlin to access university education. So for Irina, for example, it was very much possible to negotiate those stereotypes based on how the stereotype of Eastern Europe is associated with particular ways of looking, talking, moving, which she could avoid, often very consciously. And she also said that she would prefer to speak English because her German wasn't as good as her English was, but she got rid of her accent. Whereas, for example, with many other people, I could conduct interviews in German because the German was perfectly fine, but they had a very strong accent. And therefore, as they would tell me, every time they went to kind of a doctor, any kind of authorities, they would hear the accent and immediately would be treated like, oh, you're a poor beggar, and would not be able to get services, or would be treated very badly. Or, for example, when looking for a flat, which is very complicated in Berlin at the moment because there's a shortage of flats. One participant recalled that she needed to provide an ID when she was visiting the flat, and she was from Romania. And once she gave the Romanian ID to the landlord, the landlord was like, "Oh yeah, well, you know, the flat's taken. Sorry." So people had problems finding flats, finding jobs, accessing certain services, which often also led not only to kind of becoming aware of certain stereotypes, but also reproducing others. Because, as I mentioned, most of the participants I talked to could, in one way or the other, be positioned as white within racialized hierarchies in Germany. So some of them kind of try to position themselves as rather belonging to this place by directly reproducing racism against non-white people. So you could see how this kind of differentiation in whiteness actually served to uphold certain racialized hierarchies against people racialized as non-white. And to lastly get to a very important point with kind of where sex work finally comes in, as Irina also mentioned. As I said, this also very much related to, for many people, to only being able to access certain parts of the job market. That is, within the German economy, certain jobs are predominantly done by migrant workers from Eastern Europe, not only, but so we're talking about cleaning work, care work, construction work, seasonal agricultural labor. So a lot of work that is necessary to keep the economy going, yet is also very precarious work. And there's even certain ways of excluding EU migrants who, theoretically speaking, should have access to a lot of services by their EU citizenship, of social welfare programs, of health insurance, etc. So a lot of the people I met came to Berlin not necessarily with the aim of studying sex work, but they needed to find a job. And eventually they realized that only certain jobs are available to them. And then, to quote another research participant, Kasia, a woman from Poland in her early 30s at the time, said, "I did not want to go cleaning anymore for €5 to destroy myself. That's why I prefer this." And by this, she meant sex work. So for many of the participants, sex work came in as an alternative to also very precarious work, which they saw as damaging to themselves and their bodies. So most of the time, getting engaged in sex work wasn't an explicit decision for sex work, but rather against other precarious jobs, in the sense of that their perception of their available jobs always included certain forms of precarization. And sex work was just one option here that, in certain regards, provided them with better options than the others. That would be, for example, more flexibility, particularly for those who had children at home at the places where they were coming from, so they could travel more often and be more flexible in terms of when they go back and forth. It provided more money within the hour than other jobs. And I mean, this is something we see in many regions. And this is, I think, a very common reason why people get engaged in sex work. But what I found interesting is that then sex work was also sometimes seen as an opportunity to access social mobility more than others, in sense of that either people could portray themselves as successful business people or particularly successful business women when, for example, running an escort, so like not running an escort service, working as an escort, or in the context of this stereotypization of Eastern Europe as poor, which often went hand in hand with being seen as lazy. Some participants said, yeah, but we are doing hard work. We are good, hard workers. We pay our taxes, and we should be able to not be treated like this. Which, of course, they're right, but this is also kind of reproducing certain ideas about neoliberal, hardworking subjects as the basis of accessing certain rights. So again, there was this very big ambivalence of sex work providing certain opportunities, which at the same time were conceptualized within the context of actually following certain Western European neoliberal ideas of what it is to be European or what it is to become European. And at this point, I would like to end with a short reference back to this discourse about the poor Eastern European women when it comes to sex work politics, because many of the people I talked to, they also did describe very problematic situations in sex work, and none of them said they want to do sex work until the end of their lives or whatever. Yet, as it became clear, the alternatives were also not exciting. Yet, the stereotype of the Eastern European woman is often used to argue for the criminalization of sex work or the criminalization of clients. which then also includes this reference to like exiting and bringing people in other jobs. It is never talked about what those other jobs are. So actually those discourses kind of reinforce putting particularly Eastern European migrants in certain precarious care or cleaning or construction or agricultural labor jobs, therefore serving rather to reproduce this hierarchy of which migrants get which job instead of breaking any kind of problematic hierarchies and exploitation. And at this note, I would like to end and thank you very much for your attention. And I'm very much looking forward to your comments and also wish you a nice afternoon and evening. I don't know how long I'm going to stay here as it's already almost 9. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a wonderful way to get us started here. And so our second presentation is by Tunay Altai, and the title of his talk is Crossing Borders, the Intersectional Marginalization of Bulgarian Muslim Trans Immigrant Sex Workers in Berlin. And it's a co-authored paper with Boche Yurdakul and Anna C. Kortowek.
Yes. Thank you, Rachel, for the introduction. Thanks, Randall, and everyone else for organizing this event. And Ursula, it was great to listen to your presentation. I was especially inspired by the little pictures that you put from Berlin. So I think my presentation will nicely tie into some of the themes that you already introduced. So yeah, my title is Crossing Borders. So this article is published almost 2 years ago, and it was again a fieldwork-based research done in Berlin. So Anna is not here today, but she sends her greetings as well as Gökçe. So now let's start. So before we travel to Berlin, I mean, we're already in Berlin with Ursula's presentation, but before we travel to Berlin again, let's think about crossing borders and queer migration. So in the lives of queer and trans migrants, crossing borders not only refers to the state borders, but also the crossing of heteronormative ideals and ideals in citizenship, migration, gender, and sexuality. So queer migrants in my studies usually cross national borders, most often known as Fortress Europe, or come from the European peripheries and minoritized groups, as in the case of the Bulgarian trans sex workers in Germany. So in my work and in this work that I'm presenting today, crossing do take different meanings. It appears as a necessity for queer and trans migrants to live a fulfilling life. It is a critique of the system or an act of agency against silencing and exclusion of certain marginalized groups. So the research, the sex work research, stands in the center of multiple and overlapping crossings in relation to national borders, gender and sexuality, as well as the stigmatized associated with the moral borders separating good work from bad ones, especially in the case of labor migrants. So that's kind of the angle that I'm taking with crossing borders. So about our study, so the limited scholarship on migration and sex work in Europe mainly focuses on the issue of human trafficking, which perpetuates victimization of immigrant women at the cost of undermining complex experiences, as well as motivations of migrants who are occupied with sex work. Our objective with this article was to offer a situated and intersectional analysis of the lived experiences of trans migrant sex workers from Bulgaria and Berlin. So it's a smaller group in compared to Ursula's work. And we aim to tease out the connection between borders and intersectionality. So Ursula is approaching it from the freedom aspect, and I will talk about it briefly in the next slides. We are seeing as like a collection of bordered anxieties. That was not also I wrote when I was listening to Ursula. So that's why we just wanted to play with the idea of borders. So overall, in this research, we ask how state and non-state actors take part in the marginalization of trans migrant sex workers through bordering practices that sort them into gendered and racialized categories. But these categories often, in the case of our research participants, appear in 3 major ways. So first we have the contested stigmatized occupation, which is sex work. Then we have gender identity and sexual expression, which we call transness. And then we have the minority status, which is being Bulgarian Muslims. So now let's see what we mean by bordering. So we are thinking together with Davis and others, and we understand bordering as a collection of regulatory state practices that limit migrants' freedom of movement while at the same time marginalizing them via sociopolitical processes. So bordering happens in the space where we are looking at regulatory state practices, but as well as how they are reproduced by non-state actors, as in the case of sociopolitical processes. So good thing is that we already started talking about the legal framework of sex work in Berlin, but I think it is important to mention once again. So as all of you know, sex work has been a very divisive topic among feminist scholars as well as policymakers in Europe. And the legal world is very important because the legal framework kind of plays a major role in defining the conditions in which sex work happens. So that's why we have to also keep in mind when doing sex work research. So one of the dominant frameworks in Europe is the Nordic model. I'm not going to go deep into that, but we can talk about it in the Q&As. If you're not very familiar with the Nordic model, basically it starts with the decriminalization of selling sex, but then criminalization of buying sex. And on the right-hand side, you can see a group of sex work activists protesting the adoption of this model in Scotland in 2020. As Ursula mentioned, in the case of Berlin, we don't necessarily have a Nordic model, but we have legalization, which stands for regulation. So whenever we have legalization of sex work, we are talking about regulations, which means that doing sex work is legal, but it is highly regulated, meaning that how to do sex work, where to do sex work is regulated by the state. And when sex workers do not follow those rules or regulations, they can also face criminal offenses. And the condition in which the most major change that happened during our fieldwork happened in 2017, which was the Prostitution Act, asking for Prostitution Act of 2017, which introduced the mandatory registration of sex workers in Berlin. So these were kind of the legal frameworks that I worked with during the fieldwork. So whenever I present this project elsewhere outside of Germany, I always add a slide about sex work and Berlin. It is kind of known to all of us, but still I find it interesting to think about Berlin, because obviously as sociologists, sometimes we are too dependent on what's happening right now. But Berlin also has a very rich history of street sex work and sex work. So for those who are interested, we have some interesting material that we can check. One is Anglo-American writer Christopher Isherwood's 1967 biography talking about street sex work in Berlin. And then we have some documentaries, one from Rosa van Kranheim, and then one more recent movie from 2019 called Searching Eva, basically kind of a documentary about the life of a feminist anarchist sex worker from Italy in Berlin. So I like thinking together with these materials because obviously understanding street sex work and sex work in Berlin comes with like a very rich history and culture of buying and selling sex. So it doesn't happen only in a bubble, but it happens in the historical context. So now after covering the legal framework and kind of like being reminded by the historical context, let's talk about our ethnographic data. So now the ethnography itself is a bit dated because we conducted our fieldwork and interviews mostly between 2018 and 2019. So first of all, we connected to a larger group of 10 sex workers during the fieldwork process. Most of them were first-generation migrants who had moved to Berlin within the past 15 years. So they were, I think, slightly older than Ursula's participants. They were aged between 35 and 55. Within this group, we conducted biographical interviews with Turkish-speaking sex workers from Bulgaria. So the group that we interviewed, Bulgarian Muslims, they were mostly Turkish-speaking people. Some of them didn't learn Turkish in Bulgaria, but they picked up Turkish. They learned Turkish in Berlin because they were socialized with other Muslim communities. So that's why, as a Turkish-speaking researcher who was involved in sex work activism before, I had kind of an entry point to talk with the people and understand their experience. So we also conducted interviews with people, social workers, people who were active in sex work NGOs. And while doing the research, one important aspect for us was to researching with rather than on sex workers. So this was one important thing that we introduced in our fieldwork. We were very much inspired by a sex work research institute in South Africa and creative methodological roadmaps they prepared for doing ethical sex work research. If you ask like how we did it, we other than the primary fieldwork locations, we attended public events organized for and in collaboration with our research participants, met regularly with other people who are involved in sex work activism in Berlin and had background talks. I also attended the 2018-2019 Core Parade in Berlin and talked with people who were active in the field during the time. So I would like to talk more about the challenges of doing sex work research. We can talk about it more, especially if you are a researcher currently interested in the subject. We can expand on this during the Q&As. So other than the issues connected to methods and methodology, of course, we learned a lot from researchers and the literature available to us, but we also learned from sex work activists. So there's a lot written about sex work by sex workers. So it was, as researchers, it was important for us to understand how they describe their work and the industry. So for example, one concept of hierarchy resurfaced a lot when I was talking to sex workers in Berlin. Basically, hierarchy underscores the legal and social boundaries, which are more permissive towards non-contact activities like stripping, cam girls, than high contact activities or full service activities like prostitution. So so that's why we were trying to kind of create more intellectual bridges between sex workers and people, academics who are doing sex work research. Before I introduce my findings, one other thing that we did was, of course, we used intersectionality a lot. Intersectionality, I mean, even when you think about hierarchy is a form of intersectionality because it is showing us a certain intercategorical complexity, which we understand as the sex worker or the image of sex work. But in reality, it is much more diverse, much more heterogeneous. That's why intersectionality also guided us when we were understanding certain categorical complexities, such as the idea of Eastern Europeanness, the idea of Bulgarianness, Muslimness, transness. So all those type of things were complicated in our field. We weren't afraid of the complexity, but we just tried to make sense of it in our analysis and writing. That's why the title is very long, lots of categories, but yeah. So now let's introduce the findings. So I will now give the main finding in one sentence, but don't be overwhelmed. We will unpack that. So the main finding is this lengthy sentence that says, our study demonstrates that everyday bordering experiences derive not solely from national border enforcement and citizenship regulations, but also from intersectional sociocultural barriers imposed by non-state actors, and that the internal bordering practices of the German state that exacerbate the exclusion and marginalization of sex, gender, transgressive people, and sex work. So this lengthy sentence says basically, it summarizes, first of all, why we decided to work on Bulgarian trans migrant sex workers in Berlin. So I think it was very much connected to precarious freedoms Ursula mentioned, because their presence in Berlin as EU citizens is legal. They have freedom of movement, they have freedom of labor, they can actually do the work. Sex work is legal, they are doing illegal work. So actually, when you look at the case itself on paper, everything is fine, everything should work out fine, but it doesn't. So that's why we were interested in working with this particular group, to understand this gray area between legality and illegality, or legality and marginalization. So that's why borders and bordering as a concept was very helpful for us to understand how borders continue to live, even though they legally do not exist, for example, between Bulgaria and Germany. They do exist, but obviously for migrants, they are allowed to come, but then they face bordering experiences, which are born from bordered anxieties of German state. So let's now unpack the findings. How am I doing with time?
Great.
I'm great, thanks.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, so we kind of like listed our findings in three categories. First, I will talk about minority belonging within EU and German politics. So, so here's a map of Europe and some other countries like Turkey and Russia, and here you can see the Bulgaria and actually it's not Germany, the other one. Anyway, so the interesting thing was the Bulgaria became an EU member country in 2007, but the first increased Central and Eastern European migration to Western Europe and Germany started with the 2004 accession and the 2007 financial crisis. As Ursula said, in Western European countries, migration flows from European peripheries into Eastern Europe was seen as dangerous and undesirable. So for our participants, because they were coming from also Muslim background, so they were racialized to a certain extent in Bulgaria, they didn't have access to rights and services growing up in Bulgaria. Some didn't have access to education. Some of our participants were illiterate. They were struggling with homelessness, drug addiction. So there were a lot of trauma that they brought along while they were traveling from Bulgaria to Germany. And migration in that sense, or their decision to migrate from Bulgaria to Germany was motivated with their minority belonging to Bulgaria, but also their trans and queer identities, which only exacerbated the conditions that they experienced in Bulgaria. So this minority belonging or their minority identities shape their communication with the other Eastern European migrants and also Eastern European sex workers in Berlin. So they were very clearly defining something called Temiz Bulgarlar, clean Bulgarians. So it was almost kind of like a boundary work between whiteness or white Bulgarians versus what they represented for themselves. So they didn't necessarily see themselves as part of the Eastern European sex work scene. That's why they were mobilizing with other categories like being Muslim or being Turkish or Turkish speaking. So in the interviews, we captured a very strong sense of regret and stuckness. As you remember, most of the people that we interviewed lived in Berlin for more than 15 years. But for example, one participant whose name was Chichek, a 47-year-old sex worker, said, "I can't stay in Berlin, I can't go back, I'm stuck, and this is my life." So the stuckness was not only due to their stigmatized profession, which is being a sex worker, but at the same time, their progress in their transition. Some of them had families back home. Some of them had daughter, son, a wife, and they weren't really aware of the life of our research participants in Germany. So that's why the being stuckness was the nostalgic connection that they had to their past in Bulgaria, but at the same time, the realization of not being able to leave Germany any longer. So another participant said, I regret having moved to Berlin, I regret Bulgaria, I regret Germany, but what can I do? At least I can make 5 or 6 euros a day here collecting bottles from rubbish bins. So this participant named Nesrin, she was also a street-based sex worker, identifies as a trans woman. One thing, I mean, from her experience, she said she was collecting and returning bottles for their deposit. We had this deposit system in Berlin when she wasn't able to find sex work. So this was a very crucial point as well, because since most of the people that we interviewed were doing street-based sex work, not having a customer for a day means that they don't have food to eat for a day. So it was something very crucial. So for that reason, having at least some sort of a safety net, if you can call it that way, which is this alternative way of like searching and collecting bottles or making a living, or the NGO system that supports them in worse conditions, was a motivator for them to stay in Berlin. So the second issue that we saw was encounters with medical legal institutions. So as I said, all of our participants identified as gender transgressive or trans in the interviews. So some of them were interested in reaching to services connected to gender confirmation surgery, hormone replacement therapy, as well as legal change of gender status, name, and sex following medical interventions. But they were facing challenges, of course. So first of all, at the time of this research, Germany required a medical diagnosis of gender identity disorder and real-life test and long-term supervision in order to access HRT and other medical treatments. So luckily it changed now. Germany recently passed a law for self-determination. It is not yet enforced, but it's a good step for sure. But what happened with the previous regulation was that some of the interviews, some of the participants that we had would experience transness, but because they didn't have access to education and some of them were even illiterate, they couldn't necessarily describe their experience of transness within the ways that therapists would do it. So they didn't have access to the Western notions of transness in a way that would allow them to get access to services. So one issue was this thing about transness and their ideas about their own gender identity, which they would define in Turkish as öbür türlü, other way. So they would just define themselves as other. And at the same time, when we spoke with the social workers, they said without a job or registered place of residence, there was no way for our participants to access state insurance. So normally in Germany, state insurance covers some of the cost of HRT treatment, but for the participants, it wasn't possible. So we prepared a graphic to explain the problem. So here you can see, without a job or registered place of residence, there is no way to access state insurance. They are required, so this is the second quote you see is from a social worker who says, they are required to find an apartment to obtain a register of residence to register as a sex worker, and a steady income to find an apartment. So it is German bureaucracy at best. So this is the vicious cycle that we saw. And surprisingly, or not surprisingly, many of our persons were stuck in this vicious cycle. It was impossible to enter without having or obtaining one of them. But in order to obtain one, you need to have the other. So that's why we prepared this graph: safety at work, stable jobs with papers, place of residence and housing, health insurance, access to medical services, safety at work. Because access to medical services for most of the trans sex workers would mean that they are safer at work, because now they have the right ID to show when they are getting checked. Now they present as feminine or woman if they want to, but because of this vicious cycle, they weren't able to enter the system. So finally, let's talk about the new sex work regulation in Germany, Prostitution Act of 2017. So according to European law, any EU citizen may legally engage in sex work in Germany. So it is an officially sanctioned form of self-employment, as Ursula also mentioned briefly. So it's a self-employment, and you have to declare that you will earn at least 600 euros a month and hold a valid health insurance in Germany. So as I said, going back to the vicious cycle, it was already impossible for most of my participants. So one interesting part, one interesting thing about the New Prostitution Act for me was, as a researcher working in queer migration, although the document itself was regulating sex work and migrant sex work, it didn't even mention migration one time. So it was kind of acting as a de facto migration document, making it more difficult for Eastern European or foreign sex workers to work in Germany without necessarily stating it as such. So new administrative requirements for sex workers in Germany, blurring the line between legal and illegal work. So all of a sudden, legality did mean regulation, but mandatory registration means that some people who are not registered for a reason are now doing illegal work. So for us, it was a form of migration management mechanism in disguise of protection and care, because the act itself was introduced as a Protection and Care Act. So there is also one very recent thing that happened. Maybe we can talk about it in the Q&As as well. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz made a public announcement 2 days ago, and he said that he doesn't approve the idea of women selling sex to men, and that's why they're planning to introduce a new change to the Prostitution Act. The details are not clear yet, but it is on the agenda, and we are seeing another like a public debate going on sex work in the next weeks and months. So some concluding remarks. So this project for us was kind of like shifting our focus from borders to bordering experiences. So understanding kind of like an afterlife of border crossing, like how do borders can be studied, especially when we are working on groups who've been in a country for more than 15 years, but they still kind of face the after effect of borders in their everyday life through state and non-state influence and actors. Limitations due to regulation, so that was an issue for us as well, this connection between legality and regulations and marginalization. As you can see with the vicious cycle, we saw that complex and reluctant German bureaucracy actually works as a bordering practice for some groups, because some groups are just not able to navigate their way in the system. And we saw the overlap between sex work, gender transition, and migration, which was very clear for our participants, but still a very difficult subject to work on. The next issue was overlaps between sociocultural marginalization and legal and bureaucratic regulations. So one interesting thing is that so Eastern European migrants are not desired, and the state policies also reflect that. But when we looked at real estate market, insurance companies, they also reproduce that stigmatization. So they kind of continued that bordering practices or the logic of bordering and exclusion, and they also continued marginalizing and excluding people who carried the markers of those identities. So the future directions for us is basically, I mean, with this work, I think we allowed a lot of, we showed a lot of complexity, our way of understanding labor migration, Eastern Europeanness, and sex work. So for me, the interesting part was definitely dehomogenizing the myth of European migrants and labor migrants, because obviously, sometimes when we think about Europeanness, we don't necessarily think about the complexities that it holds, especially in relation to East-West relations. The second thing for me personally, the future direction is studying how queer and trans migrants mobilize for sex workers' rights in Germany. So this is the work that I'm doing at the moment. I am actively conducting a fieldwork research with migrant and refugee drag performers and how they use their stage to mobilize for sex workers' rights in Germany. So that's the future direction that I'm in. So with this note, I will thank you all. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Two really terrific papers here that give us a lot to talk about. So we have about 20 minutes to ask questions and of our both speakers. And so we'll start with a question from Randall.
Great, thanks. Fascinating for both of you. I should say you've come to the right place, because here at the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, we only added Western Europe in 2001. Our focus was very much East before then. And indeed, we don't say Eastern Europe, we say Central Europe. And language is important here. Calling them Central Europeans reconfigures our sense of the continent. Question for you, Ursula, fascinating. And I entirely agree with the point that you have to understand the choice for work as a choice against other forms of work and view this as a feature of late capitalism and the bifurcation of the labor market into the high skilled and low skilled. I didn't know where you rested, though, exactly in your normative commitments. Given the economy as it is, do you regard sex work as the best alternative and therefore to be viewed as such, or not? Question one. Question two for both of you, is there a difference in terms of sexuality? When I did my interviews with NGOs in Hong Kong and Thailand, what the NGOs working with queer sex workers, trans, gay, bi, chiefly cis men in the case of bi, said was that the work was viewed by the workers as a positive expression of identity. Now, I didn't test that with other NGOs, but I wonder if you saw any difference on the grounds of sexuality between straight sex workers and others. And for you, Tune, I wonder where the domestic pressure, the pressure is coming from, this change in policy, if it happens. Is it within the parties, or is it lobby groups? And when you flashed Kurfürstenstrasse, Ursula, on your slide, which of course a hotspot for sex workers in Berlin. I did interviews around there, and what's fascinating is the first wave, second wave divide. Any NGOs who were second wave feminists or that age were to a person opposed to sex work, and the younger women at NGOs were in favor. When I spoke in Berlin, all the NGOs I talked to were utterly opposed to sex work and wanted it recriminalized. So are they driving this, or did I just talk to the wrong NGOs?
Great questions.
Ursula, would you like to go first?
Can do so, yeah, sure. I also wanted to, before I start, there's a question in the chat. I would also briefly answer to that, if that's okay. But
yeah,
I will
we should
answer.
have welcomed our online audience. Thank you for that. Absolutely, do send in your questions.
But I will answer to your questions first, Randall. To the first one about best alternative, I would say I would not, like, what does good and bad mean in that context to begin with? So particularly, I'm not a sex worker. I have no experience in this, and if it's good or bad, that's a personal choice in a way. My point rather was that there are alternatives. Also coming back to the comment in the chat that it's often said, yeah, people don't have alternatives. They do. Maybe not each and every one of them, but generally they do. And I mean, judging from the interviews, people had very ambivalent opinions about it, in a sense of that also they wouldn't go into a question, what is a good and a bad alternative, but rather, because people had ambivalent opinions about sex work as well. So people would acknowledge that it had certain advantages to the other jobs, but at the same time acknowledge that there is certain problems that come with it. All the legal issues mentioned, stigmatization being part of those, but also questions of what does it do to your body to do sex work, and certain aspects that come with it. For example, a lot of alcohol use in certain brothels and so on and so forth. So I would stand at the point of it was an alternative. For some people, it had good sides and bad sides. For some people, it had more good sides than bad sides, or the other way around. Personally, I would, I think, stop at this. And sorry, what was the other question again, to both of us?
The sexuality question, if this
the sexuality question,
different, the identity kind of.
So in regards to sexual identity and orientation, so I didn't mention that before, but so there was also a variety within my research. So some people were heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual. I could not see a clear tendency here that there were big differences in terms of, you know, reasons for engaging in sex work, etc. Differences rather came also with kind of how that played out in sex work, for example, what clientele they were catering to. So, for example, the men I was working with, the cis men I was working with, were working in bars in a way that they don't exist in that way for female sex workers, for example. So that gave kind of different circumstances of working, also then in terms of, you know, workplace safety and so on and so forth. So it was, in my research, rather this kind of, with certain orientations came certain access or lack of access to certain venues and forms of working. But in that sense, I also think that there's more research to be done to go further into this. One thing I would say, though, which I got the impression, but again, this is also maybe something Tuna can say more about it, is kind of, I mean, Berlin has a very big queer scene, as we know. And although it's big, you see effects of general marginalization of queer people. So for some people, their queerness became something they could market in sex work, which like non-queer heterosexual women, cis women, had not. I mean, they would market other stuff, but this was kind of something that came up sometimes, that in that sense, identity became something that could be marketed more than in other contexts. And to briefly address the question in the chat, which is, how do sex workers perceive the self-value in connection to their work? Have to share how they found the first job in sex work in the hierarchy of job functions. I think the hierarchy has already been mentioned by Tuna, the hierarchy that was clearly there. So also within my research sample, the people who were not working on the streets were partially talking bad about sex workers on the streets in the sense of they would never do that, and that people look so poor and so on and so forth. And particularly in the more high class level you go, the more this became also a thing of, you know, I make a lot of money and so on and so forth, to position themselves in a high up in the social hierarchy. And the self-value in connection with their work varied, I would say. I mean, generally, you could see effects of stigmatization in sense of both on like a personal or social network level, that people couldn't be open about their job, couldn't be open where their money comes from, shame, of course. But people reacted to that in different ways. For example, Susanna, who I quoted, she was very open about, yeah, you know, I'm open about my job because I don't want to bother with people who have issues with sex work. And so that's why she would tell people right away that she does it, and was very confident in this. But others had very different opinions on this, and also would kind of see this even beyond like interpersonal relations as a problem, and like having a negative effect on their self-worth. And at that point, I end and give over to Tunay.
Oh, yeah. So thank you for your questions. So I will respond to the second one about queer sexuality and sex work. So it was very visible for my participants. We even had like 2 of our participants were cousins from the same village. And one of them was older, and he said he arrived to Berlin first, and then he always knew that his cousin was also different. So he's using the word different rather than queer or trans. And then he said he got back to Bulgaria for him. And then the cousin also moved to Berlin, because the cousin knew about the path of leaving Bulgaria, arriving to Berlin, doing sex work, and then either living a queer life, transitioning or not transitioning. So it is, but it's just for them, it was a certain sense of gender deviance or homosexuality, which is really difficult to capture with one word, because they also didn't use one, that they shared. It almost acted like a community glue. So it was one thing that like it was a glue between them. So yeah, it was a connection. So this idea of being a minority in Bulgaria, and then having the gender deviance or being arbitrary, being different. And that was a motivator. And sex work really played an important place. So we also shared what happened was that usually on Fridays, they would gather in an NGO space to have dinners. And we also attended dinners. And then after the dinner, they would glam up to prepare themselves for the street sex work. And that part of glamming up was the most joyful moment they had over the week. So they would all gather, they would put on nail polish, hair, the like makeup, and they would kind of like exchange clothes with each other. So that was the moment that they loved. Like it was a sense of community that I think they didn't have access to anywhere else. And also a camaraderie, because I mean, they were going out the streets together. They knew where they should be in that street, which was also interesting to us. I mean, I don't do urban sociology, but still it is. So although they didn't have any other place or space available to them, they weren't entitled to any other place in Berlin, but that street was theirs. So it was clear. So all the sex workers knew that if you go to that street, that will be the street of people that you'll find like a Bulgarian trans sex workers. So which part was this? It was again close to Kufrstand. Okay. Yeah. So for that reason, the process of glamming up and preparing themselves for sex work was again affirming their queerness and their transness. So that's the connection that I see. And like going back to your first question about like alternatives, I think in Ursula's sample, Ursula has more like highly educated people as well. But in my sample, the question of alternatives didn't necessarily come up that much because they weren't educated. They didn't have access to English, or they spoke German, but it wasn't very good. So I think the alternatives were not very present. But still, some of our participants talked about leaving sex work or not wanting to do sex work with us. But as sex work researchers, there is this issue about there's a bias. Like when you are a non-sex worker person interviewing a sex worker, sometimes they want to be received as respectable. Well, yeah, that was the respectability bias. And that's why they say that they would rather leave the work, because in your eyes, they see or they assume that you might be judging them for being a stigmatized work, although it is not the case. And again, reminder, we were speaking Turkish, a language that they shared with their families. So I think that played a role as well, but of course we can never know for sure. But we always have to keep in mind, especially when we come from a place of like institutions or researchers or universities, there is a bias that gets out. And the domestic pressure. So the third question, Ursula, you might be following the German discussion better, right? So what was your sense? What did motivate Olaf Scholz to talk about sex work in this moment?
In this very particular moment, that was because he was asked by a CDU, so the Conservative Party politician, and he was asked about his stance on sex work, and that comes from the CDU. 2 weeks ago, maybe, the Nordic model is now their official party position. So the CDU came forth as the first party like that is in parliament making a distinct decision on advocating for the Nordic model. Other parties also have initiatives, like they are all fighting about their stance on sex work, because that divide goes through all the parties in Germany. And there have been lobbying groups for years and years and years. I mean, it has been building since the 2000s, at least, I would say. And yeah, so this one particular politician called Dorothea Bär, and I think she's responsible for some family women's something department in the CDU, which is not in government right now. She asked Olaf Scholz about this, about his stance, and then he answered that what Tunay said. And because the SPD has also quite a few members who are very strongly advocating for the Nordic model.
And sorry, two questions. And do these tend to be the age of second wave feminism? I mean, are these women in their 50s and above?
Partially. So the main spokesperson that speak out publicly in the SPD would be, but I mean, there's quite a few, and this is maybe also coming back to the questions of NGOs you were speaking to. Like there's quite a few NGOs that would also like draw younger women in particular. So it's mostly women who speak up out about this.
Okay, so we've just got about 5 more minutes, so just want to collect questions here. So yeah, okay, we can go over a little bit since we started a little late. So I see you, I see Professor Parañas, and then I see this gentleman over here.
Thaddeus Blanchette from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, the National Museum, Brazil.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Congratulations to the both of you for the very, very relevant work that you've put in. Ursula, my question is to you. You talk about precarious freedom, or something that I understand as bounded agency or constrained agency. And you also talked about how social mobility was sold to these individuals as freedom. I'm curious to know, what were their conceptions of freedom? How did they conceive freedom? And did their conceptions sort of converge at a point?
Okay, hold that one. Great, thank you.
So I'll limit it to one question. So I'm curious about the governance of sex work that you've kind of just alluded to, but didn't really break down. So I'm very curious about the Prostitution Act passing around the same time as anti-trafficking legislation was being globally,
Funny how
you
that
know, yeah.
works, isn't it?
And then so it's like I mean, I see it as a positive political move by Germany in a way to make sure that prostitution is not conflated with trafficking, which is what was globally happening during the time. So I wanted to know who was behind this and whether that has had any effects positive on the experiences of people on the ground compared to, let's say, a country that was like vehemently conflating the two.
Great question. Okay, so we'll hold that one too. And
One comment on terminology and then one question following Dr. Hansen's comment on terminology. Can we not use Nordic model? Every one of the 4 countries in the Nordic area has a different law regarding prostitution. Denmark's different from Sweden, and even Sweden and Norway is a little bit different than that. So I don't think we should fall into the Swedish government's idea that they somehow represent all the Nordic countries on this. Okay. So, but the question I have is always coming from Brazil is, so what are the cops actually doing in the street? I mean, we're talking a lot about, you know, police officers and how they work. Do the police really work as advertised by the law in Germany? Because we know that in Brazil, you know, the police have this immense discretionary power, who they're going to go after and who they're not going to go after. That's the individual cop on the beat that decides that. And I'm wondering if how that plays into this. What there's all sorts of sex workers, I assume, working on the streets of Germany that are illegal. So who do the cops go after and why, and how does that work out? And is there anything that people would call corruption involved? Though I have problems with that word. But is this as clean as the German government and its people always seem to project it to us poor corrupt folks in Latin America?
So 3 really wonderful questions. Would you like to start?
Yeah, I can. So yeah, thank you for the questions. And so what happened was that in 2017, when the law was introduced, and I think it was enforced shortly after, a group of sex work activists went out and registered themselves as sex workers because they just didn't want the system to work. Obviously, at the end, you have to trust the state that they would protect your rights, but then you're also creating a registry for people who are doing sex work in a country. I mean, as someone who comes from Turkey, I never trust the state, but I also went to sex work meetings in different countries, and some people really do trust the state. So it's always very, very different to understand like where state stands in all this discussion. So I think with your question about the presence of police and how police is being perceived by the sex workers, so I think obviously, like I will go back to the issue of hierarchy. For street sex workers, it is more present because obviously you have to stand in the street, and then it is more likely for you to be tracked by the police, and police already knows which areas are being used by the sex workers. So so yeah, from their experience, police wasn't something that they were happy to see, let's say. So it wasn't there to protect their rights or freedom, but it was something that they were hesitant to interact with. So one interesting thing about with my research participants connected to your question about freedom, because they were from Bulgaria and they were coming from this minority background, so they didn't necessarily have a sense of claiming their rights or social state. So they also didn't understand activism. So they didn't necessarily come from this place where they can fight for their rights on the street and claim something from the state that they might be entitled by law. So they didn't understand the concept that well. So for them, although they were the subject of activism and people were protesting, so I attended several marches happened, they weren't present there because they just didn't understand the reason. So it maybe disrupts the idea of freedom and rights from that way, because I think they were more interested in survival, community, but other than that, it was like a very closed group. So they didn't necessarily have access to, or their way of thinking about the state and sex work wasn't connected to rights. So the motivations beyond 2017 registry is, maybe Ursula, you may have a better idea about what motivated the 2017 change. But what I know is that maybe you can also complete. So with the registry now, the state has more rights. If you register yourself as a sex worker, you also state your address. And for example, if you're a sex worker, then police has different rights to enter your apartment without a warrant, and they can search for different things. So actually, it is not as liberatory or good for sex workers' freedom. But yeah, Ursula, do you have anything else to add on this? Yeah.
I do, and also coming back to very basic things of terminology. So I think it's important to keep in mind that in Germany, there's 2 laws in the recent 20-something years. And as far as there's the Prostitutionsgesetz, which literally translates as Prostitution Act, but that's 2002. And then the 2017 law in German is Prostituiertenschutzgesetz, which translates to Prostitutes Protection Act. So it has kind of this protection in there. And the story behind that is that the 2002 legislation didn't legalize sex work, by the way. Sex work was legal in the Federal Republic of Germany since the Federal Republic of Germany existed. But it got rid of the legal stigma of being an immoral activity. So that granted some very basic rights, which didn't change much in the end, but it's not legally immoral anymore. And then late 2000s, early 2010s, there was an evaluation of this law. And that showed that nothing much changed because the law itself didn't include much. It's like 3 paragraphs long. And because of that, a lot of people were then arguing, yeah, we need to do more. And sex workers' rights activists were saying, yeah, well, that's because you gave us a very tiny law that didn't help us much. Whereas anti-prostitution activists were like, yeah, this liberalization and there's always often it's being said, yeah, it was legalized in 2002, which is not true. That caused all the problems and all the human trafficking. So human trafficking comes into this debate. And that actually also coincides with EU enlargements. So the debates started when Eastern European migrants could access German labor markets. Side note. And yeah, then that eventually resulted in finding another very shitty compromise, making a law that should protect sex workers by making them register. And actually the only thing, apart from having to deal with a lot of legal problems of data protection, being illegalized if you can't register and so on and so forth, is that the information is forwarded to financial institutions. So basically it makes sure you pay your taxes.
Where is making a despised minority register with the state ever gone wrong in Germany?
No historical precedents on this whatsoever. No,
Go ahead if you have one more. Go ahead.
To the conceptions of freedom, varied. And again, this is also part of a problem of translation because I'm not using the word freedom so much in the actual text. But for example, what I found a very interesting point when it comes to kind of social life people had in Berlin, apart from sex work. There was also a lot of, like, with cis women, some of which like migrated to Berlin to stay there, others went there for work and then went back home. And they did not have much contacts in Berlin to other people, which is often seen then as, oh my God, they're isolated and so on and so forth. But the women I talked to actually saw this as having certain freedoms they would not have otherwise in their like social networks in like other places where their family lives, because a lot of family obligations would come with this, and also childcare and so on and so forth. So it was an interesting point that came up very often with sex work, that it's not only the flexibility of being able to go back, but also being in Berlin, having time just for yourself, and being able to like, even if it like it things that sound simple, but it was like just having a quiet walk in the park, which people wouldn't been able to do otherwise. So it was very often little things that come to that, and not necessarily the big questions of, you know, freedom to do everything or whatsoever. I mean, this partially goes back also to the question of like sexual and gender identity, because that's something that also in my research came out more with like queer sex workers, that there was also kind of this relation of freedom of expression, your like gender and sexual identity. So that was more of an issue than like moving to Berlin to stay there, to be free from certain conservative family or social contexts.
Okay, well, this has just been a wonderful beginning of this workshop, and I just would like to have one more round of thanks for our speakers. And Ursula, I wish you could be here to join us for coffee, but we're going to have a little coffee break here, and we'll resume at 3:30. 3:40.
We can have a few minutes. Yeah.
For the film.
Yeah, exactly.
For the film. Great. Thank you. So it's a tremendous pleasure to be able to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Carenas. And I just had to actually put her website up here because there are so many parts of it that are so beautiful. I could actually speak for half an hour about all the amazing work Marcel has done in relation to sex work, gender, migration, labor politics over decades now. Really been a frontier, cutting edge theorist and deeply empirically thoughtful, now world spanning researcher. And so in addition to being incredibly prolific and writing all these deeply influential books, Russell is also a yogi in academia and can actually turn upside down. Look, so I just have to show you that. Oh, you can't quite see it. Okay, yeah. And so please do explore all of her extraordinary accomplishments in your free time. But I just really want to thank you for coming to speak at this workshop, because it really also shows the interdisciplinary interest. And thank you so much. The title of your book, of your paper right now, is
Sexual Labor and Capital.
Sexual Labor and Capital. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah.
For being here.
So, thank you. Anyway, thanks for still being here on a Friday evening. You know, it's like I can imagine funner things that we could be doing besides talking about sex work. It was great to hear the papers earlier and to see Professor Nick Mai's film. And so this has been good for me as well to revisit my work on migrant sex workers in general, And yeah, because it's a conversation that I still want to continue to be part of. I time myself here not to go over. And so we haven't really covered the literature so much in this, very like short gathering that we've had today, this afternoon. But I would say in general, I'm not going to give you this boring lit review, so I hope we take my word for it. But generally in the literature of sex work is split into two, that there's a binary in which you have scholarship that's focused on the governance of sex work. And then there is work on the labor of sex work. Yet those two are often addressed separately, with much of the work on governance focused on anti-trafficking efforts or advocacy for labeling such workers as traffic victims. Then you have works on the labor process, and many of them, though not all, talk about the labor process within just the context of the workplace or customer, client, worker interaction outside that governance context. And so in my work, my former student, Maria Cecilia Wong, I think we've always tried to just bridge the two. So I'm going to revisit how I've done that and add to it in this talk. So sex work, I think everyone in this room would agree, is work. But unfortunately, I think the vast majority of people not inside this room would disagree with us. And it's a pervasive argument that's been advanced by the likes of, I'm just going to name them, like Donna Hughes, Melissa Farley, Kathleen Barry, Janice Raymond, our best friends. And they see sex work as a human rights violation, and that's their argument. And they've been very happy with the passage of the the 2000 Trafficking Act of the UN, because they feel that something they've been screaming about since the 70s and 80s, they finally have legitimacy. They don't look crazy anymore. I mean, they've said that publicly. But, I think the vast majority of people agree with them that sex work is a human rights violation, but I think we know that this conflation is not just inaccurate, but it's also not substantiated. So I just want to make sure we're on the same page here. So trafficking is defined by the United Nations and adopted by the Council of Europe. The US definition is slightly different, but many countries adopt the UN definition, which refers to trafficking as a three-part process in which one has to first be transported from one location to another, does not need to be the transportation of someone across a border. Second, they have to be duped or coerced in this process. And third, they have to be subject to exploitation, with exploitation referring at a minimum to first sexual exploitation, and then forced labor, slavery-like practices, and servitude, and the stealing of your organs. And so the contentious issue here is, the definition of sexual exploitation, which was never defined by the UN. And so this is sort of the point of argument of all these feminists, where some groups will say, well, it's a human rights violation, therefore prostitution is just exploitation. So despite that belief, there is scant data that supports this claim of conflating sex work and trafficking. And so the question for us is, why is it so pervasive, right? So it makes us ask these questions. Why is the public quick to embrace this argument without the need for verification? And why is why is our instinct not to demand proof of it? And what is sex work anyway? And so in this talk, I want to address these questions. My goals include first, dispelling this false conflation of sex work and trafficking. Second, I want to address this question of how do we start really examining sex work as a labor process. And so my talk will draw from an earlier project of mine in which I worked alongside a group of migrant workers in Japan. They're called Japayuki. They're Filipino migrant entertainers in Japan. And during the time I worked for them, they were actually labeled by the US Department of State as constituting 70,000 of the 800,000 estimated trafficked persons worldwide. And so that's like they constituted almost 10% of supposed trafficked persons worldwide. And so my talk, again, like I said, I want to bridge our discussions of governance and experience in examining sex work. And I want to do this by theoretically interrogating the gendered morality that shapes not only how we understand their work, but also how they experience that work. And so to examine morals, I rely primarily on Michel Foucault's work as my theoretical foundation. More specifically, I'm drawing not from his first volume, but the second volume of the history of sexuality. Everyone always goes to the first. The second one is pretty good too, and his discussion of moral subjection. And so basically, I'm arguing that the migration of hostesses as sexual laborers in Japan is a process of moral subjection, a gendered moral subjection, and it's a subjection that they negotiate in their everyday life. And so what do I mean by moral subjection? So turning to Judith Butler and her explication of Foucault's discussion of moral subjection, Butler helps us understand this process when she states, quote, even if morality supplies a set of norms that produce a subject in his or her intelligibility, it also remains a set of norms and rules that a subject must negotiate in a living and reflective way, unquote. So key to understanding the process of moral subjection then are first, there's a key set of moral norms that shape all of our experiences. Second, we're not over-determined by these norms, but we negotiate them. And third, building from Mary Douglas, there exists multiple moralities, multiple moral standards, some of which do not necessarily reflect these norms. So in this talk, I'm going to apply my discussion of gendered morality to the experiences of, again, I said, the Filipino hostesses I worked alongside with in Tokyo. And I will investigate processes of their moral subjection in order to examine the gendered moral norms that shape their experiences as sexual laborers. And the term sexual laborers is something I'm going to go back to. And I want to do this to explain why the public generally views the work they do negatively and have mistakenly assumed them to be not just quote, prostitutes, but like people forced into prostitution. And so some of these gendered moral norms that shape their experiences include what Viviana Zelizer has described as quote unquote the hostile world's view, and what Martha Nussbaum and Gail Rubin refers to as a sexual hierarchy. So the hostile world's view refers to what Zelizer describes as this rigid moral boundary between market and intimate domains. And so in a nutshell, like a market domain is calculated, and that's where you get like paid to do something. And the intimate domain is something you do altruistically. And then when these moral spheres collide, then they're not supposed to collide. And that's what's going on with sex work. And that's why I think people are just like, their first instinct is to be repelled by it. And then for Martha Nussbaum, a gendered sex hierarchy defines our sexual activities, resulting in stigma that limits the tolerable sexual activities, and for her, particularly of women. And then lastly, Gail Rubin acknowledges that the sex industry is embedded in gender hierarchies that points out that this industry is not a cause, but a medium. So in her classic essay, Thinking Sex, Rubin pushes us to consider how, quote, sex is a vector of oppression, with sex for reproduction being the only thing that we're supposed to do, and anything outside of sex for reproduction is a bad thing, with hierarchy, obviously, with sex work being at the bottom of that hierarchy. So it's in this framework that those suspected of sexual labor then confront what Maria Wong calls the gendered policing of borders for the sex workers that she studies. So these gendered moral norms are important because they're not just, they do not just result in morally misguided assumptions about like the wide range of sexual labor that people do, but it also ends up shaping the actual experiences of people who are sexual laborers. And so in the case of the women I work with, the hostesses, they often have to negotiate the misunderstanding of their experience that results from these gendered moral norms.
And so one clear example is how they've been identified as trafficked persons. And this has impacted their lives, resulting in the greater scrutiny of the state in their migration. So these gendered moral norms also make the sexual labor of hostesses transgressive acts, raising the question of whether or not the morals of hostesses reflect, recuperate, or contest these norms. So, what are other results of the gendered moral norms of the hostile worldview and the sex hierarchy? So these gendered moral norms lead to, first, the stigmatization of sexualized occupations. Second, the misunderstanding of sexualized jobs. They're often reduced to prostitution. Also, it's commonly assumed that any participant in a sexual occupation must be coerced somehow. And third, these moral norms lead to unsubstantiated claims of human trafficking. So these gendered moral norms are what helps to make sense then of why claims of trafficking are like easy to embrace and not reject, despite the absence of grounded empirical studies. So then there is quite a need for us then to undo the various misunderstandings of various types of sex work, and we're actually even like not even sure what is the job entailed when you do sex work, because it exceeds the actual act. It always exceeds the sexual act. So what is that labor process that gets you to that sexual act? And so the talk that I'm going to give today that tries to get into those questions that I've been raising is based on 11 months of non-continuous field work that I conducted in Tokyo, in which besides working alongside these hostesses, I also interviewed them. I interviewed 45 cisgender and 11 transgender hostesses. As I said, I also worked alongside them in a hostess bar in Tokyo. So let me now get into the sexual labor of hostess work. So sexual labor is a term I prefer to use over sex work due to the latter's, despite it being a word that sex workers reclaimed, it's still being reduced to prostitution. And so I use the term sexual labor. We all know that sex work basically refers to the exchange of sexual services for money or goods. But I use sexual labor because in contrast, it situates prostitution in a wider spectrum of different types of labor that require the sexual titillation of a customer. So in one end of the spectrum would be scantily clad waitresses in Hooters. And in the other end would be those engaged in the actual selling of sex acts. And so I like to use this term sexual labor and situate prostitution in the spectrum in order to underscore how it is not this exceptional job, but it actually relates to many other kinds of occupations that we find acceptable in society. And so hostess work itself is interesting because it involves like a wide range of that spectrum in which some hostesses actually engage in sex acts with customers, but some don't do more than what someone who works at Hooters would do. And me, I was like terrible at it. And I was like, or try to just look like someone from Hooters. And I don't think I did a good job with that either. And so then it's important to point out that hostesses need not rely on sex to secure their patronage of customers. It's because it's not sex that they produce when they engage in sexual labor through commercial flirtation. Instead, what they're doing is they're buttressing the masculinity of their customers.
Yes.
So hostesses, buttress the masculinity of customers by relying on particular forms of accrued capital, and specifically like their bodily, emotional, and cultural capitals. And so while it need not involve the performance of a sex act, I consider hostess work as a form of sex work because hostesses have to sexually titillate the customer via commercial flirtation. And so for hostesses, sexual titillation, contrary to what is said in the Trafficking in Persons report that the U.S. Department of State releases, it does not involve the provision of sex necessarily. So instead, hostesses sexually excite customers either by seductive dance or song performances on a stage or by sexual banter at the table. And so the hostess bar where I worked, it required all the workers there to like sing and dance in a bikini on stage.
And then I remember when I was starting, it was so funny. But the manager was like, called me. He was like, "I have a meeting." I'm like, okay. "We really regret to inform you that the management decided they don't want you to dance on the stage in bikini. Because you don't want to scare the customers away." I was like, they didn't even know how relieved I was. They thought I would be like so devastated, but anyway. So the people I worked with had to do that. Not me. But yeah, so people had to sing or dance naked, not naked, but almost naked. In hostess clubs, these styles of sexual titillation vary and include, but are not limited to, these coy displays of innocent affection, overt but yet comedic demonstrations of desire, such as blowing a kiss to the customer, or like exaggeratedly jiggling your breasts, or engagement of blatant dirty talk, use of witty conversation in the very rudimentary Japanese, and the display of subtle and sometimes not so subtle physical gestures of affection, such as a hand around the shoulder, or a hand on the thigh, or a tap on the forehead. And so hostesses do not rely on these sexual acts universally or uniformly, but instead each cultivates her own style, according to not just her personality, but also her morality and moral standards on paid sex vary across the community, with some morally accepting the commercial use of sex and others don't. So in Japan, customers are unlikely to patronize hostess bars for the purpose of soliciting prostitution. One has to realize that there's this variety of businesses that exist in Japan's nightlife industry. So much so that we need to recognize these distinct markets in each of the sexual labors and the defining features of each type of exchange. So hostess clubs occupy a particular niche in the nightlife industry, as men specifically go there to flirt. In contrast, men go to image clubs for sexual stimulation via role play, pink salons for fellatio or masturbation, soap lands for a full service bath with an option of sex, and lingerie clubs or no panty bars for sexual excitement. So the nightlife industry offers an elaborate range of services for the sexual titillation of its mostly male consumers, that one could easily argue that commercial flirtation is like kind of the meekest of services. But still, despite that, the US Department of State still felt inclined to say that all these hostesses were traffic victims. And so for hostesses, the act of flirting is the easy part of the job. Most identify this thing that they're required to do, which is like they have to perform a dohan. A dohan is basically what they need to fulfill their sales quota, because the dohan costs, around the time of my research, $100 for cisgender clubs and about $40 for transgender clubs. And so so clubs expect hostesses not only to flirt, but they have to generate sales, right? So one generates sales by the dohan, meaning it's a date out. So the customer has to meet you outside the club. If the customer does that, pays $100 to meet you outside the club, then he gets 1 hour of your time in the club. And so hostesses define the doha as the, a practices. So what's interesting is the hostesses see the doha as like just accompanying the customer through the door of the club. So you can literally meet the customer outside the club and not interact with him so much. You walked him into the club, and that's your doha. And so the people who get to do that obviously are very skilled, because how do you get a guy to say, meet me outside the door and I'll give you $100? But sometimes, however, the customer requires them to eat with them before they go into the club. But regardless of how much time hostesses spend with a customer outside the club, they get to spend an hour with the person, with the hostess. Because how it works, so this is how it works. The customer comes in, and then there's a parade of women on the side, and then he looks at them, and then he'll say, I want that person. And if they want that person, they have, and that's called the shimei, then they have to pay. But if they're too cheap to do that, then women circulate in 15-minute rotations. So then I was the one who was always standing there. No one ever picked me. No, just kidding. Actually, so once someone picked me, I was so happy. I was like, yay, finally. So in female hostess clubs, like I said, it's like $100, it's like about $100 that they have to charge. But then in addition to that, they have to buy $100 worth of food inside the club. And I think that's why some of the customers are like, yeah, I'll just meet you outside because I don't really want to take you out to eat. And then I'll be required to like then
pay $100 of food inside the club. And so this Dohan then is like a very successful revenue source for these clubs. And that they actually pressure the hostesses that if they don't have a certain number of Dohans every 15 days, they subtract what they could have earned from their commission. If that makes sense. Like, so if you were going to make $50, but you from that Dohan, but you didn't have one, they would take up $50 from you. But so people see that as because of that contentious policy, non-governmental organizations say that that is proof of forced prostitution, because then these people have to like go out on a date with these guys, even if they don't want to. But contrary to the stance, like talking to the hostesses, they don't see any harm in the Dohan, and they see it as kind of like, well, I'm here and I'm doing my job, and if I don't get a Dohan, then I'm not doing my job, and that's what I'm being paid to do. And so then there's kind of an argument, well, no, they're not supposed to do that. They're just supposed to sing and dance naked on the stage. So that's when the kind of the iffiness of whether this is trafficking comes in, and people argue about it. But the hostesses that you will meet in these clubs, and I went to many of them, they will agree with this transgender hostess, Nikki, who says, quote, you can't really say this is prostitution. She says, quote, if there's prostitution, then it's your choice. You can choose to allow them to take you to a hotel. If you go to a hotel, you can hold a customer that will support you until the end of your contract, and you have to give him back something in return. Everything we do here is our own choice. There's nothing that we do here is forced, unquote. So while acknowledging that not all hostesses have sex with customers, Nikki reminds us that some do choose to do so for pleasure, material gain, or both. So the comment of Nikki could be construed as naive, as hostesses without doubt are more vulnerable to sexual assault and harassment if outside the confines of the club, and alone with a customer. And it's for this reason that the club warns hostesses not to meet their customers in private places, such as a residence or hotel, but instead like just do their Dohan in a restaurant, a mall, or a park. And so the Dohan, I would say, is more like a compensated date. It occurs before a club opens and not after it closes. And so clubs usually operate between 8 p.m. and 4 a.m. So if hostesses and customers do go out after the club closes, it's something they do outside the business of the club, but hostesses are still subjected to a 6 a.m. curfew. So the question is, how do hostesses secure a Dohan and increase their sales if they're not providing sex? In other words, how does one manage to convince a customer to pay a club an additional $100 for the mere service of having someone walk them into the club? And so why would someone pay such an abundant amount of money if they're not going to receive fellatio or sex? So like I noted, hostesses need not rely on sex to secure customers, because customers do not go to clubs to have sex. Instead, they go there, as one hostess put it, quote, to feel like a man. Hostesses then make customers, quote, feel like a man by cultivating particular forms of capital, bodily, cultural, and emotional. And so I found that hostesses have resourcefully developed creative ways to secure the loyalty of customers, depending not on sex, but on other forms of accrued capital. And Pierre Bourdieu defines capital broadly to refer to, quote unquote, accumulated labor in its materialized form or its incorporated embodied form, which when appropriated on a private, that is exclusive basis by agents or groups of agents, enables them to appropriate social energy in the form of reified or living labor. So capital does not emerge naturally, as Bourdieu has asserted, as a logical outcome of their habitus, meaning the set of dispositions that we do. Capital, according to Bourdieu, emerges from this unconscious incalculation. As he said, cultural capital can be acquired to a varying extent, depending on the period, the society and the social class, and it happens like unconsciously. But in my findings, I found it's not necessarily just unconsciously, but people actually consciously cultivate it. And so I diverged from him in that sense. But I still build from him. And I found that hostesses then turned to the accumulation of these capitals I mentioned to raise their marketability, which are categories I introduced in thinking about the nature of sexual labor. So in their world, meaning the social field of the hostess club, the cultivation and possession of these types of capital increases their ability to, quote unquote, using Bourdieu's words, appropriate social energy, unquote, from customers who in response would visit regularly, spend more freely, and sustain relations with hostesses. And so bodily capital refers to the physical attributes of hostesses. That's their level of attractiveness. Emotional capital relates to the emotional attachments of customers. And cultural capital has to do with one's acquired knowledge of cultural norms in the club, as well as one's acquired cultural skills, such as their command of Japanese. And so these forms of capital generate customers because they enable hostesses to do the job, which again is buttressing masculinity. And so the anthropologist Anne Allison likewise observed in her much earlier study on hostess clubs that men patronize these clubs so as to bond with other men, and hostesses merely function as like like kind of a support so that men can bond with each other. And so hostess clubs is, where they do these business deals, and according to Allison, it's a male ritual. So while this is the case, we should take note, that Raymond Connell said gender is always constituted relationally. So in order for hostess clubs to be a space of male ritual, hostesses have to be there to enforce the masculinity of that male ritual. So let me now talk about each of these forms of capital. So starting with the bodily capital of hostesses. So bodily capital refers to these physical attributes of beauty and femininity. And it's their basic prerequisite of employment, and something they then cultivate, maintain, and manage, consciously in their everyday life. And so they engage in what Louis Bourquin says is bodily labor, meaning the refurbishing and retooling of corporality. So in this case, bodily labor would refer to the cultivation and maintenance of one's physical appearance and features, so as to be sexually desirable, and bodily labor is done individually and collectively. And so the hostesses evaluate not just themselves, but also one another. And they comment a lot on each other's physical appearances, deride each other. They don't just deride each other. I mean, they'll say you look good, but sometimes they're like, oh, you look terrible. And so comments about their appearances extend to the sharing of beauty tips, from improving one's wardrobe to learning how to pluck one's eyebrows correctly. And so like me, I was always obviously the brunt of this. And they're like, you need to curl your eyelashes. And then they introduced me to eyelash curlers. That was that. And so the constant regulation of physical appearance in the community indicates the significance of bodily capital in their work. And the marketability of hostesses really depends on their beauty, how much a customer should spend in the company, how much they receive in salary, and the types of clubs they qualify to enter are weighed according to one's physical attributes. So in a hostess, so there's this market of hostess clubs there. There's A clubs, B clubs, and C clubs. A clubs is like supermodel clubs, B clubs is like, and C clubs is like not attractive at all. So I would say the club I work is like, I don't know. Yeah, but it was important, And so while female hostesses tend not to invest in plastic surgery as a means of like cultivating their bodies, I should say that transgender clubs, it's almost required that they do so. And so if they want to return, like, because their contracts are only 6 months, if they want to return for another 6-month contract, usually transgender hostesses are mandated to do like plastic surgery of some sort for them to be able to come back for a second contract. And so, but what's interesting is that the physical transformations they do is not just external, but it's also like internal. So they do a lot of like skin whitening creams for the thighs. But like they have these things called that they were selling across clubs when I was working there, like vagina tightening sticks, and then douches. So we know that sex work happens in those bars. So let me now move to emotional labor. So like, well, the physical beauty of the woman, of the hostess, like, is what reels in the customer. Then the challenge is, well, how do we keep them, right? And so this is where emotional labor comes in. And like, how do you get these people to be attached to you that they keep on coming back, right? And so this is a term coined by Arlie Hochschild, in which, one manages one's own feelings in order to evoke a particular feeling from the customer that you are interacting with. And so for women, then they want to, I'm building on Hochschild to say what they're doing is then because she was only looking at flight attendants. And so her analysis of emotional labor is fleeting. And so this is more like if it's a durable interaction. So if it's a durable interaction, how do you keep them coming back? And so you need to acquire emotional capital. And so then these emotional capital would be like love, compassion, sympathy, and benevolence, right? And so one way that hostesses raise emotional capital is by making customers feel special, emoting love and affection while calling customers on the telephone, sending sweet nothings on text messages, makes customers think, oh, they're thinking about me. Then generating feelings of pity is another thing that they do. Other people have talked about this, like Kimberly Wong, to get people, like they say, oh, like I'm starving, so then we feel sorry for them. And so if we're to situate the emotional ties of customers and hostesses in their geopolitical context, it would make sense that pity more than affection would generate emotional capital. So they kind of build, like kind of emphasize their poverty. So the emotional ties between hostesses and customers occur in the context of this very unequal relationship of not just gender and class, right, but also nation. So then that is something that the hostesses, I found like that was most prominent in the way that we're building emotional capital. And so then they do that often by saying like, oh, you know, my mother is like sick. So this is something Mark Padilla also talks about this. And so they often talk about just like the hardships that they face growing up in the Philippines. But the manipulation of emotions by hostesses indicates that the act of securing customers depends not only on one's sexual desirability, like I said, but it's like really these cultivation of emotional attachments is how you get like, you know, frequent, like regular customers. And what's very interesting is that it's not like love necessarily, but like I said, it's really like kind of sympathy for the women that keeps the guys going. So you could just see how they feel so masculine because it like enables them to be some form of provider, right, for these like downtrodden people. And so lastly is the cultural capital. So the one of customers for heightened masculinity leads me to this third form of the capital that hostesses need to cultivate in the club. So to do their job, they need to learn how to maintain the masculinity of their customers in their daily actions. So the cultural capital, this cultural capital is one that they eventually acquire with experience. Of course, it requires the cultural capital of language acquisition, as one of my coworkers said, quote, no matter what you need to learn how to speak, no matter what, you need to learn how to speak Japanese so that you and the customer could understand each other. But the cultural capital of maintaining the masculinity of customers also relies on one's familiarity with the norms that guide relations in the club. And so I found, like most saliently, that the women had to decommercialize the flirtation. And then they always had to indirectly and never directly ask for money. So they really had to kind of almost abide by the hostile world's view, because that is the normative moral system that the guys still want to be attached to. That this still kind of guides the men's behavior. So decommercializing flirtation is very interesting. Like they so I'll just give one example. So this one person I interviewed, I'll just quote her. She says, I put my heart in my work. I will say, oh, you poor thing. No, let's not order that because it's too expensive. You say that if they offer to feed you. So sometimes you just refuse their offer, even if you're hungry. You tell them that you will just eat the peanuts on the table. So she consciously tells customers not to spend money, so as to suggest that she wants him to come to the club, not because she needs his money, but because she really likes him, right? And so the decommercialization of hostess and customer relations also occurs outside the club. Like many other hostesses, they throw these freebies sometimes, like, oh, I won't charge you a dohan, you know, I'm just gonna like hang out with you, so the guy feels special. And so then, so to maintain the masculinity of their customers, hostesses have to learn how not to threaten it. And so hostesses avoid threatening their masculinity, so you know never to ask them for food or drinks because they might not have money. So then if they don't have money, then they're embarrassed because they can't afford their drink, right? So then the women will just know to say, I'm so thirsty, you know, but not say, give me a drink, you know. So that's like another strategy that they do. So let me just conclude so that we have more time to discuss this. As I said in this talk, there's like 3 forms of capital that I found that hostesses did in order to do their job of sexually titillating their customers in order to buttress their masculinity. And that's like bodily, emotional, and cultural. And so in this talk, I'm just going to emphasize like what I wanted to. I just want to summarize what I want to underscore in this talk. And first is that I want us to really like de-exceptionalize sex work, and we need to de-exceptionalize sex work by talking about it in a wider spectrum of various types of jobs that entail sexually titillating another person, right? And so I think like we're kind of stuck of exceptionalize. We inadvertently exceptionalize it, and we need to stop doing that in order to counter these discussions of human rights, it being a human rights violation. And so then I also want to, and I think what I'm also trying to do is, because we have this like split between people who are like sex positive and then non-sex positive, but I think maintaining that binary is also very dangerous. And I think that binary is dangerous because then it delimits how we're able to analyze the work that they are actually doing, and that it prevents us from really getting into like the labor process that is nuanced, complex, and goes beyond the actual sex act that people are either defending or rejecting, right? And that I think we need to focus instead on identifying the various skills that are utilized and developed and cultivated in this profession that not everyone is able to do. And so a third thing that I want to emphasize in my discussion is to always be conscious of the gendered moral norms that determine not just how they're regulated, but to be mindful of how those gendered moral regulations actually impact the experiences of the people on an everyday basis. And so my last point is we need to examine that sex work not in a vacuum, but in our analysis acknowledge, how these norms kind of limit the way we even perceive their experiences. So let me just end there.
So do you want to field questions?
Sure. Sure.
We have, I'll take
Yeah.
down, right? And if there's anyone online who would like to send questions in, or we're here and we can see anything you might be adding here as well.
All right.
Yes.
So I have a question of curiosity. So I would love to hear more about your first entry to the field. Like, how was it for you to negotiate your space in a club?
Okay.
How was it interacting with other workers?
Okay. So yeah, thank you for your question. So just commenting on my field research. When I first went to Japan, I had read all of this, like, news reports mostly, but some scholarly works coming from the Philippines mostly on the situation of hostesses there. And as you can imagine, they were all like negative, and they were all like sensationalized, and they were like, oh, they're forcing the prostitutes. And so then, but I still, so I thought they were just prostitutes, right? And I had all these misconceptions about them. And then, so when I got there, those misconceptions kind of blew up in my face, and so then, how did I act? So I would try, so where do you find Filipino workers in any community? That they will be in a church, they'll be, so I started going to church, a lot of churches. And I would go to scantily dressed people, Filipino women, and they'd be like, oh, are you a hostess? And they get so mad at me. I'm a white. Yeah, they would say I'm white. And then the one who looked so demure, it was like crazy. They were like the hostesses. So that was like something, like they just didn't look like that type in your head, right? But then I would ask to an appointment to get to interview, they would always like not show up. And so that was very frustrating. And then finally, like, I don't know, I met a nun, and the nun said she did, quote, apostolate work, where she went to a lot of the clubs and the residences of the women and prayed with them. And so I accompanied her, and then she introduced me to a madam, one madam, and the madam she introduced me to as a journalist. She's like, this is my friend, the journalist. And so the madam let me work in her club. And so for free, because I couldn't, because it was just complicated if I get money for it, right? And then, but even if I didn't get money for it, it was so crazy. I was like, one day I would be like, I'm tired, I don't want to go to work. And then I would get a call at 9 p.m. Where are you? I'm like volunteering here. Like, and she's treating me like I'm some paid worker, like demanding I show up to the guy. It was crazy, you know. And she's like, your customer's here, you have to come here right now. Anyway, so then what was interesting, like before I worked in a club, I would meet these women. I would say, can I interview with you? Like they would all say no. But then after I started working as one, and I would say, oh, I work at a club, can I interview you? They would all agree to meet with me. And I think one of the reasons why, and I could see it, like if I never worked in the club, I wouldn't have known what to ask them. And I would have had so many misconceptions about the work that they do. But because I worked at the club, it was just like a much easier conversation. But I still had false assumptions. Of course, I had false assumptions.
Participant observation.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, but that really, because I think a lot of people here are sociologists rather than anthropologists, this really underlines why participant observation is so important.
Yes.
You learn the questions you need to ask,
Yes.
which you won't if you just walk in and start passing around questionnaires.
No, that's correct. Yeah.
Great,
Okay.
yeah, really fascinating,
Yeah.
Russell. A few questions. One, just a technical one about ethics approval and
Oh, yeah.
how that went
Yeah.
for you. I guess a question, I don't know if I have the technical term for this, but how did you get at the truth of the matter? Was it just observation, or I'm thinking of the interviews with the other workers? So you mentioned that they would tell the workers, so the workers would tell the clients it's difficult, talk about the difficult situation, emotional, pull at the heartstrings. It remind me, not the sort of research you did, but I did a little bit of this in Singapore, chatted with a few hostesses, and then said, off the record, if you tell me this story, and it was always, I'm in terrible debt, my mother, I'm helping my mom. And at the time, I kind of just believed them and noted it. I didn't do anything with this interview. Hearing me now, that tells me that this was possibly a story for me rather than the truth. How did you get around that? Was it by not asking questions and or because is the fact that you were one of the workers, did that give you a privileged position? And then, sorry, and the third question, actually, I'll save it for the second round. Go with that first.
So, ethics was, I think everyone here knows there's like a gray area with IRB, right? So you say, I am going to work in a hostess club. A hostess club is where you entertain, you don't kind of get into it, and they'll just approve. So I said, so in there, I didn't say, oh, these were people identified as traffic victims by the U.S. Department of State. I think it's like not going to go anywhere, right? I just said they were hostess workers, migrant workers from the Philippines, and I'm going to talk about their labor migration, right? It was so generic, and I got that. And then I think I even got the exception thing that I don't need their signature, and I always put, if I have them sign and they're migrant workers and they're forced into debt bondage, they'll be traumatized by the signature. So then I always say that, and I get away with not having, because it is awkward. It's like, can you sign this form? And it's very awkward.
And that's great risk, actually,
Absolutely.
which is, it's meant to obviate the whole process. Sorry.
So and so then that's what I did. And then I think with this particular study, I was living in Tokyo when I said it's not like, so non-continuous, so it was the participant observation that was not continuous. I did not work for 11 months. I just physically, I couldn't bear it, and so I was in and out of the club. But I was a customer in so many clubs. And if you sit in a club, you just hear them talking. So you hear,
And then my coworkers also, they would just like tell you, like, okay, I'm gonna tell this guy. You know what I mean? So they tell you like, oh, look at that guy. Okay, this is my strategy today. Like, or so you learn from them. And during the course of my few months in Tokyo, there were a total of 24 coworkers that I had at a club. And so there were quite a lot of them, and they would open up about like, what they would give me tips a lot. They would, and it was, yeah, we were very different. That's the best way to put it. Like, I was so like, I was not skilled at all. It was what they valued, I didn't value. What I valued, they didn't value. I mean, it was so clear, and so it was quite a learning experience. Yeah. Yes.
A question quick. I've kind of been looking at like the gentrification within cities around Olympic hosting. Tokyo has come up, and I'm gonna really butcher this name. The red light district in Tokyo is Kambacho, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
of course. So one thing that I kind of came across is that we talk about gentrification, and this includes the erasure of erotic zones.
Yes.
And this was policed in Tokyo, or the case of Tokyo anyway, around like early closuring. So more
Yes.
legislatively as opposed to like police presence, and this kind of gave police the ability to come
Yes.
in and say like at 12 o'clock, if you're not having, we're charging, we're fining.
Yes.
In just, I guess, more curiosity sense in customer kind of flow, was this like busy times were late night, or is this sort of like an earlier day thing? Because I know you mentioned business meetings as well, and like this is within my own hegemony, right? But
Yeah.
these are kind of things that I kind of picture take place in like earlier evenings. So what is kind of going on, I guess, that they're looking to limit these kind of late night activities, but allow these places to open in sort of the earlier hours of the evening?
Oh, for those clubs you were talking
Yeah,
about?
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's just like, what do you call this? Like, it's like, kind of, that public face that they want to have,
Okay.
right? But I think does not go beyond that. But it doesn't, I don't think, prevent what the activities that happen behind closed doors. But I do think that they have a lot of these symbolic public facing laws.
So you believe it was maybe more public than?
Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Okay,
Yeah.
understood.
So I got questions, like a lot of stuff.
Okay.
But a
Yeah.
first round question,
Yes.
then maybe we can take this into
Yeah.
getting into your questions. Why does this always get talked of as trafficking?
Yes.
But the first round question I want is more, first of all, I want to say how refreshing it was to read your work at the same time that Ana Paula and I were getting involved in the same sort of ethnography in Rio de Janeiro.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
And to like read someone on the other side of the planet who's seeing the same stuff that we were
Yeah.
and going, we're not fucking crazy.
Yes. Yeah.
There's, oh my God.
Yes.
So I really just wanted to
Yeah.
thank you how important that book when it came out
Oh, yeah, thanks.
was for us.
Yeah.
To just be able to go, oh God, we're not nuts. There's someone else
Yeah.
doing this. The one thing I have with the capital, the Borderian
Yeah,
kind
yeah.
of analysis of capital and I think this might be because of the split between sex work in Asia and sex work in Latin
Oh, yeah.
America. If we
Yeah.
use Weberian ideal
Yeah,
type to
yeah.
divide these two, how little that capital really makes a difference in many ways.
Yeah.
You know, like when I sit in clubs, and maybe it's because Anna goes in and she's presumed to be a sex worker,
Yeah.
I go in and I presume to be a client.
Yeah.
How little the men look at the women,
Yeah.
how little the men,
Yeah.
so the women get involved in these huge things. Oh, this is gonna be
Yeah.
my strategy
Yes.
this night,
Yeah.
and how little it really
Yes.
affects. Like when
Yes.
you talk about
Yes.
the body capital, what really do these guys
Yeah.
consider to be beauty? And when I was reading your book, I was like, is it really that standardized an issue of
Yeah.
beauty in Japan that everyone does this? Because
Yeah.
like when you go to clubs, there is a standardized issue of beauty, but rather if a guy goes out with this person or that person, doesn't really, like one of the women that we interviewed that sold the most programs
Yeah.
was a dwarf.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And it was just because she was a dwarf.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you
yeah.
wanted to like have sex with
Yeah.
a really pretty blonde or brunette
Yeah.
woman, there's lots of that, but you want to have sex with a dwarf. She was
Yeah.
the only dwarf there was.
Yeah.
So she actually got more clients than everyone else.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, to what degree this isn't.
Yes.
I think a lot of Frederick Barth's with his studying about fishing
Yeah.
in Norway.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever read that.
Not that one. Yeah.
Yeah, because he talks about how all the fishing captains all
Yeah.
go to the same place.
Mhm.
Because if they fail, then they all fail together.
Yeah,
And I wonder if to a certain degree, this building of a bodily capital and
Yeah.
compartmental
Yeah.
capital
yeah,
isn't the same sort of thing.
Yeah.
Everyone has to do the same
Yeah.
thing, but the patternization is
Yeah.
actually occurring in the brains of the women
yes,
who are doing it rather than in the clients. Because what
Yes.
the clients actually want
yes.
is kind of, it's kind of a grab bag in
Yeah.
some ways. And so I was wondering, is it really that different in Asia that it really has to be this patternized?
Yeah.
Or is it the women that are driving it because of this? They think that, okay, if we fail, we all
Yeah.
fail together kind
Yeah.
of thing.
So, you know, with my discussion of bodily capital, I don't get specific about the attributes that the women have to have, right? And so there's just these standard, I do think in the kind of hostess clubs I was studying, like not overweight,
Okay,
like you're right. But then in terms of just like, you know, there's things they can't, for many of them, it's like the skin color they have is just that. It's interesting. They don't necessarily talk about, oh, we have to stay away from the sun. They don't talk about that at all. But it's more like weight that becomes a major issue for them, but also like keeping up their appearance and like, you know, hairstyle is good, makeup is correct, right? But I never kind of say you have to have these big, you know, so I was never.
sounds like they police themselves
Yeah,
rather
yeah.
than the clients.
Yeah, no, for sure. And then the clients are, and they'll always tell me like, you would be surprised, like what they think are like pretty here, like ugly women are they
Yeah, yeah.
considered attractive here, and we don't understand it, but you know, and so that's why I was vague about. I don't talk about the attributes because that depends on the customer and it's so varied. But the women still like know that they have to look presentable to the client.
I just want to put a pin in
Yeah.
that though,
Yeah.
because it's the women who are kind of
Mhm.
disciplining the other women as to what
Yes.
is acceptable and is not acceptable. in the
Yes,
club.
yeah.
It's not the guys going in there saying, all right, I want you to be this way or that way.
I mean,
But it's market driven, right?
yes, yeah.
Yeah.
But they do like,
Right.
like my customers,
It's like customers that have interacted with me are like, I like you because you don't have nail polish.
Right, yeah.
Like, and so they do say, no one has ever told me, I don't like you because, you know, you don't have nail polish, but like one customer said, I like you because you have nail polish. Yeah.
It's market driven, but what the guy's buying is kind of up for grabs. And
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I've just seen so many clients buy so many weird,
Yeah.
different things that it's really hard for me to think that there is this male. I mean, yes, there
Yeah.
seem to be norms,
Yeah.
but the norms can be so radically
Yeah.
violated, you know?
Yeah.
that-
But then like Randall was saying, like they keep on coming back, right?
Right.
They do keep on coming back and women feel that it's because they're like presentable, feminine. And that bodily capital too is also like kind of how you act, like how you the deferent, like programming your body to be deferent to men and acting accordingly. And it's not, you realize it's not natural, you know, like the clubs, they're like intense because I mean, some people will, like women outside that context will say, this is so demoralizing. I'm so like, you know, offended. But like, so this is like the height of the seat. The women couldn't sit in a height, like the women had chairs that were lower.
Mm.
So you were always lower, like, you see, and then it was like always like, and then you had to bow, you had to like, you were all, I mean, so it's like these bodily like actions that you were programmed to do that, you know, of course I always forgot, you know what I mean? Like, let me sit in this chair, like, oh, you know, like, and you were supposed to like, you know, like toasting, your glass was always lower. I mean, it was always, you were always lower no matter what you did. So the bodily control that you had was not just in your appearance, but also in these, like, to the point they want you to be like, it's unquestioned, programmed in you to be just deferent to the guy. Can you imagine? I was terrible at it. It's like,
Because like in Rio, they gotta be hyper aggressive.
No, after that.
If you be different, you will never make.
Oh, no, but, oh yeah, so I'm gonna also say that what I'm talking about is like, I think we have to be conscious of fleeting versus durable sex work, right? Like sexual labor, like fleeting was like on the street, it's very different. Like you have to be aggressive on the street. I think in this bar setting where you're just sitting there and then the customer knows where to find you and it's like, you can, regularize the visits. So that's what you're trying, I mean, but in the street, they're also.
No,
doing
I'm
that,
not
right?
talking about
Yeah.
streets. I'm talking
Yeah.
about, sauna. clubs.
Okay, oh, yeah, yeah. No, it's
Martha.
interesting. Oh, yes.
Yeah,
Martha.
Yes.
thank you. I really enjoyed this talk. Thank you so much. And I have a question actually on the durability of the relationship, right? You cited Judith Butler and how gender moral norms, they shape us, they constitute us, they constitute the subject, right? But the subjects are not overdetermined. And
Yes.
so I was wondering how this durable relationship gets to shape the ways in which those norms are renegotiated, resignified.
Yeah. Yeah, no, so I look at like I found, not I look at, but I observed that women's morals fluctuated, right? Like where you can come in there saying, I will never have sex with a customer. Like I am a virtuous Christian person. And then that shifts for whatever reason, right? And but many come in there virtuous. Some leave virtuous, some leave not as virtuous. So that was interesting to see women's transformation in the club.
One, two, okay.
That's fine. Should I go first?
Yes, please, and then.
That's my second question. So,
Okay.
I just want to ask about the use of sexual labor.
Oh, yeah.
Sex work. So
Yes.
I'm interested because now with OnlyFans, we are seeing like a mainstream glamorization of sex work to a certain extent. Like especially like people showing how much they earn from OnlyFans, and it's only about like putting photos out there. And Instagram is already sexualized. So sexual titillation already happens on Instagram as well, on different social media platforms.
Yes.
So this could play into, and I'm thinking about the governance of sex work and how it could change the governance.
Oh, yeah.
So at the same time, I'm happy about expanding the definition of sex work to understand different ways that we offer sexual titillation or sexual labor. And it could also happen at work and at different places as well. I think there is definitely a sexual capital that we use in everyday life, beauty privilege or whatever you call it. But if we expand that, like, what does it do to the governance of sex work? Because I think the governance of sex work will keep like finding a different concept to exclude some forms of sex, some form of sex work. So like, how do you see that happening?
Well, I mean, no, that's a very interesting question because I do think that the normative governance is a liberal democracy, right? And so that most of these governments have they are committed to allowing people free will. And they only want to control people's free will if they think or can make an argument that it's harmful, right? And so then I feel like when you expand the concept of sex work beyond the provision of a sex act, and that you see and you put it in a range that include occupations that are, it's difficult to say that's harmful, that I hope it destigmatizes what is seen as harmful, right? Or it's not, you know what I mean? It's not seen as harmful, right? And I do think this is occurring in the context of a society invested in providing people their free will, Like no one, I think, will argue against that, except Trump wins maybe. But like, right, but I think generally, right? Yeah,
Especially as individuals.
yeah, I think there's kind of this, yeah, I think I think you have to see it in that context, right?
Okay, so it will be helpful for the rights of sex workers if we try to understand sex work as
It-
more expensive than only selling of sex acts.
Yeah, I think so. I think because I mean, for me, it's like really, how do you destigmatize this? How do you, I think everyone in this room sees it as not so exceptional. It's seen as this it's like, oh, it's the oldest profession. It's like different from any other job. And I think it's like we have to show, no, it's not different from any other job. It's like many jobs. And even like you have to look at like the work itself it's that fleeting act is just one component of this complex, nuanced labor that they do, and that we devalue it by not seeing that and the work entailed in it. And yeah, I think, yeah.
We were talking about Canada, right?
No.
No?
No.
Because my question is, what's the safest way for sex workers to have this job? I know Canada has
Yeah.
exotic dancer visa, not anymore. I think they canceled this program 10 years ago or something, right? I do remember it was beautiful documentary. It was two cute grannies from UK, this cute British accent. They went around the globe, basically trying to answer the question, what's the safest way for sex workers to work? And they found the Holland #2, and #1 it's the Nevada brothels. It was like they had an interview that was beautiful, excellent. About Canada, I still cannot figure out, are we legal or we not legal? What's the law? I do believe the sex workers are not prosecuted by law, but if you taking the money in the, like if it's a brothel, a business or something, that's illegal.
It's the Swedish model where it's legal to sell, but illegal to buy.
I'm trying to figure out what's the safest, because I think the safest way is, like I said, maybe like the Nevada example, or the Holland example, right? When even they have the service for some special people with special needs, they have the service paid by the government, right?
Yeah, Denmark.
Yeah, so why in Denmark, yeah, and why the Canada doesn't want to adopt this law?
Oh, I don't know
but
much
this is-
about Canada.
But this is a great
Neither do we.
way to, no, I mean, I appreciate the question in this way, just to bring it back to what you've given to us is, it is a question about governance and experience and kind of how did those come together in different contexts. And so on that note, can we just give you a huge thanks for a wonderful and
Thank you.
Randall for organizing a great day and all of our